The coalition versus the opposition. The legal and security bureaucracy versus the elected politicians. Cries of the deep state alongside those decrying the death of democracy. Over the past few weeks, Israeli political life has returned to the rough and tumble of pre-October 7th. And as the Knesset session is drawn to a close, it feels like Israel has generated more news than some global superpowers. Let's try to make some sense of it all. I'm Aylana Meisel, and this is Basic Law. In just the past few weeks, the IDF and the Shin Bet Security Service have released analyses of the failures of October 7th. The government has moved to fire the Attorney General and the head of the Shin Bet, or Shabak. The Shin Bet has opened a probe into possible Qatari money laundering by employees in the Prime Minister's office. A secret Shin Bet investigation into Israel's state police has come to light. The state passed its budget. The controversial Judicial Selections Committee has undergone reform. On April 8th, the Supreme Court hears a suit against the firing of the Shin Bet director, for whom at least one possible replacement has already been announced. This, of course, is the same Supreme Court whose president, or Chief Justice, isn't recognized by the government as he was selected through a process contradicting written law. Meanwhile, the protest movement is smaller but resurgent. The labor union and universities have threatened to strike if the government disobeys the court order. And all of this is just the tip of the iceberg. In an increasingly crowded timeline and a polarized political environment, how are we to make sense of these stories individually and as a whole? Is Israeli democracy really finally at the brink? Or, to mangle Mark Twain, are reports of democracy's demise yet again premature? And if so, what underlies the constant resort to doomsday predictions? Either way, how do we turn down the temperature and increase the chances for a flourishing, safe, long and prosperous life for all of Israeli society? So, for more insight and context, we sat down with political scientist Dr. Ran Baratz, a lecturer, former government official, and the founding editor of the Hebrew language conservative news site Midah. Ran, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Aylana. How are you?
Excited, as always. Okay, so let's start off with you just giving a bit more background about yourself, and then we'll dive right in.
Okay, so my academic background is actually ancient Greece. I'm in philosophy, but I always thought that this would be my profession and my public policy interest would be my hobby, but it turned out to be exactly the opposite. I'm really a public policy guy, and I'm interested in government and regime types. On the one hand, my other main focus is national security and military history and strategy. But I have a hand in things like economics and education and other areas of public policy. I was in government in 2016-17, in a high position in government where I got to see decision-making at the top. And I founded a few things. But really, instead of just speaking about myself, which is always like a congratulatory. Yeah. Maybe I'll just refer to three things that I published recently in English.
Great.
That will give a much better sense of the way I think and research. First one is there was a very nice book called The Classical Liberal Case for Israel that was published, and they added an addendum of articles that somehow complement the book.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote about the classical liberal origins of the real fraction in Israel that is classical liberal, which is the revisionist Zionist movement. So I wrote an article about that, available online.
Great.
The other thing, recently in Mosaic magazine, they gave it the title, What's Wrong with the Postmodern Army?, where I go over the changes in national security doctrines and military doctrines in the West in general and Israel in particular. So that's also available online.
Mm-hmm.
And third thing is actually they translated a Hebrew piece of mine from a few years ago about the bureaucracy. Also in general, but focusing on the Israeli bureaucracy, which will be very relevant to our discussion today. And they recently translated it to English, and I hope it will be also available online. So these are the three things that they really go over a lot of what I do intellectually.
which as someone who does follow your work, although I haven't read all of those, I'll say that your input and your feedback, not your feedback, but your commentary and your analysis is always quite insightful and wise, even when I don't necessarily always agree with parts of it, which I don't know what that says about me. But your
it says that
thinking
sometimes you're wrong, but it's okay.
See, there you go. So
what I'm doing should be done by academics who get paid to do those things, but the academy has long forsaken its real objective and goal in civil life, so it's left to people like me to do it.
Well, me being wrong was a great transition. I was waiting for that. It's a great transition into a question I'm going to call the "Please explain to me what is going on." Okay, because the way I open the show is I basically run through a whole series of events now that show a tremendous amount of chaos between the government, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, obviously also the protests starting up again. And I just think that it would be helpful as we start this discussion about the cultural underpinnings of what's happening, the political thinking behind what's happening, to just kind of give a quick summary as you see it of the situation now between all these different actors.
So going over all the actors will be, of course, complex, but I think there is a general theme that we can articulate. And the problem is, when reality is crazy, speaking about it makes you seem a little bit crazy too. But really what's going on in Israel is a forerunner of what we see in other Western states as well, which is the rise of a new class, a bureaucratic class. And at some point, the bureaucrats, mostly, top-ranking bureaucrats, realize that they wield a lot of power. And most of the people who are elected officials, they don't have the time to really supervise and control the bureaucracy. They get some things that they want, but the bureaucracy, for the most part, just operates. Right? They have not the carte blanche, but they have a lot of freedom to wield their power in the way that they want to. And one of the things that bureaucracies have done in the West is self-attribute additional powers to themselves. In Israel, it has gone to the extreme length of that, but I call it a bureaucratic judicial coup that happened in the West, where you can just, to describe it succinctly, we have a fourth branch of government today, and that fourth branch of government, which is combined with the judicial branch, wields the most power. And, elected officials, ministers and parliament members find themselves helpless because we gave actionable powers to the bureaucracy and constitutional powers to the judicial branch. And now they've combined their forces, and it's very hard to get that back. So this bureaucratic judicial coup in Israel has gone to the extreme length. And the real problem is that they've done it bureaucratically, meaning slowly with boring decisions that no one really realized what was going on, that they assumed small powers, but you look at it accumulate over 20, 30 years, and you suddenly realize that they've accumulated so much power, it's very hard to roll back the dice. So we'll see what's in the future, but this is the problem. We have a fourth branch combined with the judicial branch, and the democratically elected people find themselves not powerless, but not really that far away from that on key issues like what power is legitimate in what spheres of action.
So I want to understand this a little bit more deeply, because it's not just the fact that you have, let's say, a powerful bureaucracy. It's that the entire culture around who should have the power to make policy decisions has changed. Okay? Now, that's really the question I want to explore today. So to start picking away at it, I want to ask a question about the heads of the security services, just as an example. So this is going to come out on Sunday of next week, but we are now after a story where there's potentially a candidate selected to replace the head of the Shin Bet security service, Ronen Bar. Almost immediately, that candidate was criticized from all sides, including the right, because he apparently also marched in the Kaplan protests, which I'm not sure is a disqualifying factor, but certainly not what the right thought should replace Ronen Bar, necessarily. But if you look at other heads from the past, you see a very oppositional attitude toward the government. So recently, Nadav Argaman, who was also the head of the Shin Bet, was even, I think, investigated by the police following what seemed to be a threat made on air that he would release classified information about Netanyahu if he in some way violated a court order not to proceed with the firing of Bar, I believe. And you can trace this back also to the head of Shabak, Ami Ayalon, who's part of the protest movement and one of the key drivers. And you can see it even going back much farther, where Mr. Meir Dagan, I believe, he was the head of the Mossad, interviewed on CBS years and years ago, and actively tried to work against the preemptive strike of Israel on Iran. So where does the culture that enables this come from? Why is it a good thing for these people to be oppositional to government?
So the security establishment is a little bit different because in Israel they were always very powerful because they are always very popular, which is what politicians aspire to be, right? So you don't want to engage in a public fight with someone who's very popular if you're a prime minister or a defense minister. So, and of course, Israel had severe security issues. So, and these guys were entrusted with, heading the Mossad, the IDF, the Shabak. So they were popular, powerful. They wielded a lot of, they could get a lot of what they wanted approved by government. So historically, it's a sphere where the left used to say Israel is a militaristic state because the IDF wields so much political power. In actuality, right? When you have to make a decision, the IDF usually gets what it wants. But it changed in the last 20 to 30 years because of the process in which the judicial branch started going into security decisions and ruling in security spheres of influence, and the threat of the international law, overriding everything Israel does and all its military actions, which the Supreme Court said, I'm your protective vest, right? I will protect you from the international law indictments that are coming.
Right,
but only
is what they say in Hebrew.
But only under the condition that you submit to my rule, right? So what happened is that the today's heads, like unlike Dagan, today if you have Ronen Bar, he knows that it's protected by the court, and he knows that the court will, according to however the judges want, where they want to go, they can say no one can fire you, which is a crazy thing. By law, obviously the government should be able to fire actually anyone. But specifically the head of the Shabak. This is really defined in the law. Sometimes the law in Israel is lacking, vague, and full of lacunas, etc. But here it's very clear. But the court, says this is an open question. We can decide that the government cannot fire Ronen Bar, and after that, the Gali Barav Miara, who's like the legal advisor of the government. So the government, again, is, if you listen to the court, is powerless. They can't really nominate their own people. These are people who were nominated by the previous government, right? And they turn out to be in full opposition to the current government, which is a crazy situation to find yourself in when you're a prime minister or a defense minister, etc. So now, what I'm saying is they used to have real power in the sense that they were popular and they headed very powerful organizations.
Right.
But now, even if they are not popular, and even if their organizations are not powerful, they are protected just like any other public official by the court. The court has assumed the governmental power of hiring and firing. And it's not just the court, the judicial branch, which includes the legal advisors of the government, whom the Israeli court said, what they say is the law.
Right, it's binding on the executive.
Yeah, which is another crazy thing. So even if you have someone like Ronen Bar, from his perspective, is fully protected by the bureaucracy and the court. So the government might wish to fire him, but it really doesn't depend on them.
Here's what I thought you were going to say. Here's where I thought you were going to start, and I'm going to plant a seed and you can decide whether it grows or dies. I've seen over and over that on the one hand, obviously everybody has their own political mascot. You vote for a party or for a person that you'd like to see in power. Sometimes you even vote for a party that you would like to pull the party that's going to lead in a particular direction, knowing that the party that will lead, whether it's Likud or what used to be Labour or so on and so forth, will ultimately cobble together the coalition. But at the same time, there's not a lot of public trust in politicians. And there's even this sensibility, certainly within the world of law, but potentially also more broadly, that politics is, quote unquote, dirty self-interest, whereas the bureaucracy and the courts represent the true embodiment of the public interest. That's where I thought you were going to start. Does that play a role, and have I characterized it correctly, or how do you see it?
Yeah, this is the bureaucratic propaganda. I think in today's... I used to have to argue against it, but today I think it's plainly visible that this is a class, they have their own interests. This is like a public choice demonstration, a demonstration of public choice theory. There is a new class, they are working in government for all their life. This is a full career, right? They are career public clerks or whatever. And they always say they are mamlachti, right? They serve the kingdom, but really they serve their institution. They're like the place where the bureaucratic institution as a whole. This is what they focus on. Most of the decisions are explained by that. This is nothing new intellectually. What I'm saying is just it got to such a degree that was really unheard of in history because of the rise. So what I'm saying to you, I used to argue for that. I think after the judicial reform and after the war, everybody sees that they serve a different interest. This is not the public interest. This is a class. I call it a class, but you can call it an institutional interest. And it's hard to argue. I mean, of course, people would recite the propaganda, but everybody knows that Gadi Baratz's Miara decisions are not in the public's interest, but in its class or left-wing leaning kind of interest, because she even loses in court, right? I mean, even the Supreme Court says sometimes it's just crazy what you're saying.
So I wonder if your answer is going to be the exact same here. But I noticed during the time of the reform that, it seemed like one side, I think to outsiders, to people that were reading about this in English and following it, that one side was promoting rights and one side was just promoting like untrammeled populism. That was, I think, the way people saw it, was that the reform side was potentially trying to create some kind of radical restructuring that would allow for, as I said, untrammeled populism, whereas the other side was bucking against this. I saw it differently. But what I noticed was that the terms in use by the people opposing the reform often sound really, really good in English, right? Because they're drawn from an Anglo set of ideas like judicial independence, very important, right?
Rule of law, democracy,
very important. Exactly. Okay, so you see
separation of powers,
right? And they all mean something very different here in practice, which is to say, judicial independence means there can be no political footprint, basically, on the institution of the judiciary.
Okay, so finish on.
No, and rule of law has, in the States, there's more conservative, classical liberal types say, well, rule of law isn't the rule of lawyers. And here in Israel, it's gone in that direction, right? And I've wondered how these things became, basically they took on a life of their own, like how they developed their own vocabulary here, so detached from the roots of these actual terms.
It's a great question, and I'll answer just briefly. Again, it sounds a little bit crazy because reality is crazy, but...
Say it in the most sane way possible, please.
So the court assumed it had this constitutional revolution, which is their term. I'm not, Aaron Barak called it the constitutional revolution.
Right.
In 1995, based on two basic laws that passed in 1992. So it's more than 30 years. We are reaching the point of 30 years of the constitutional revolution. we had a constitutional revolution performed by three justices, right? Which is not how constitutional revolutions are supposed to work. The way history used to go.
I'm not sure you're supposed to have revolutions.
Yeah.
But okay.
But anyway, you can change your constitution, but it shouldn't be done by three justices.
Sure.
Since that time, since the 90s, and also at that time we had a Labor government when that happened. They revised. If you go back, to the details, it starts in the 80s in Aaron Barak's writings and some rulings that he has, where he starts applying new meanings to terms like democracy. But during the 90s, they actually had Yuli Tamir as education minister, actually had a new wing in the department that was supposed to rewrite civics. And what they did is that they reinvented those terms with new meanings. So all of those things have been learned in Israel. They were indoctrinated in Israel for 30 years with their new meanings that are in complete opposite to political theory. As it is now even. You don't have to go back today. I'll give you one example.
Please.
During the judicial reform, there was a political scientist from the Hebrew University who wrote that if the military is not independent, then it is a sign of a weakening democracy. Meaning, in democracy, the military should be independent from the political echelon, from the government, basically. You cannot find anything in real theory, either, the abstract theories or the concrete theories of democracy. Everybody knows that the military has to be completely ruled by, otherwise you have a real problem in your democracy. And most democracies fall because of such military coups. Okay, this is the real facts. So she went against everything, both in theory and empirical. But in the Israeli economy, it's accepted as if it's the truth. It's a demonstrable falsity. Completely false. No one in the world ever wrote something like that. But in Israel, people think, yeah, it's plausible. Why? Because, for example, they took the independence of the judicial branch to mean institutional independence. Really, the independence is in the ruling. You should be free from political pressure and from other kinds of pressure when you rule as a judge to maintain your objectivity and not be swayed by, pressures and interests. They did the same thing with academic freedom. Academic freedom means you're allowed to research and come to any conclusion you come to without being pressured to reach a certain conclusion or publish anything that pleases someone, either the government or your dean, doesn't matter. You have academic freedom. They took it to mean institutional freedom. The government cannot do anything. The academy does everything. They decide on their own budget, the way the budget is handled. No one can fire anyone anywhere. They are their own branch, right? The academic branch of government, unelected. But what I'm telling you, for 30 years, they've been indoctrinating Israeli students and pupils in schools that democracy means basically the rule of the court. It has nothing to do with the people. It's not by, for, or anything. The people are not there in the definition. It's the courts defending human rights. This is what democracy is. And you have a generation and a half being indoctrinated in those nonsense. You get people on the streets being completely afraid that the government might overrule a decision by the Supreme Court, which is a practice that you can see happening in many other countries. So in the US, it's less... it's not customary to have such, interbranch battles. But in many parliamentary democracies, this is the norm. The court can decide something. And if the parliament wants to, they can legislate something. Actually, Aaron Barak used to say, if the coalition is not happy with our ruling, they can legislate something else.
Those were the earlier rulings.
Yeah, exactly. This is the early Aaron Barak, before the radical. So what I'm saying is Israel is a unique case. We have a Haredi-like pseudo-democracy theory And it's Haredi-like in the sense that they block anything else. I always tell my students, give me one example of such a definition of democracy, such a theory of democracy that's written not in Hebrew and not by someone Aaron Barak indoctrinated. One example. For 30 years I've been asking for that. No one was able to come up with anything close.
Oh, we try to provide our students with a broad range of resources. But let me play devil's advocate for a minute, okay?
But just not to sound crazy, okay? This is you learn that in all schools.
Yes.
When you read to your civics exam, you have that there, and then in every department, in every university, it's completely homogeneous, and very rarely you will find any dissent voice, and usually it will not be in the curriculum, but something that the student can read outside class. So it's really a typical type of indoctrination that I'm trying to turn over or fight against for many years, but it's really hard because these are very powerful, in terms of education, very powerful institutions.
Absolutely. I mean, the Law and Liberty Forum does a lot of different things within the legal education space. I haven't talked about them on the show. I hope people go to the website if they're curious. But one of the things that we thought was important was to start translating classical, liberal, and conservative legal thought to Hebrew, because so much of it just hasn't made it in. So I
had a professor that once told me it was it was about postmodernism. He says it's around you so much, even if you're not postmodern, you find yourself influenced by certain aspects of it because everybody thinks the same, and you're part of that, of that niche, academic niche.
Sure.
It's the same here. I mean, even students who understand that they were led to a very unrealistic pseudo kind of democratic theory, it's very hard for them to really shake it off. It's completely. And it should be shaken off completely because their theory, it's like the definition of the people's democracy by the communists, right? It has the label of democracy, but really the meaning of that they used, the sense of democracy that the communists used was anti-democratic in the regular definition of democracy. We have the same thing here, but they're not communists. It's a different kind of power grab.
So here's the devil's advocate portion, right? Because one could look at this again from the outside and say, well, there's no constitution. The rules of the game haven't been set. And so you have some large percentage of the country that's concerned that if you don't educate in this way, and if you give the politicians, let's say, an unrestrained hand, that you'll have basically a tyranny of the majority, so to speak, or the tyranny of many different minorities in this particular case, because we have a coalition. How do you address that idea?
So you can say a few things. First of all, we have a constitution. Aaron Barak gave us a constitution, right? So
you accept the Barak constitution as the Israeli?
No. From his perspective, right?
Okay.
So now I'm playing the intellectual game.
We're both devil's advocates.
But I'm just showing you that this is nothing to do with some sort of substantive theory. It's just a power grab.
Okay.
Because at first they said the basic laws were not supposed to be a constitution. They are the constitution, and they give us the power to have judicial review and to send laws back to their doom, right? Yeah. To abolish laws legally legislated by the Knesset, because we have a constitution. These are the basic laws. Mm-hmm. But now, after the reform, they started abolishing basic laws.
Right.
So now they have a constitution that's above what they used to say is the constitution. I never thought it was a constitution, but they said we have a constitution, basic laws. Now they abolish basic laws, not based on any internal contradiction, but based on a higher constitution, which is like the values of the system, right? It's something that they have. This is not written and unknown to anyone outside of the justice's consciousness. So it shows you it's a power grab. They don't have any real respect to anything constitutional. Just it's a power play. That's one aspect of it. The second, I lost my train of thought.
I'm trying to ask, about what restraining elements there are that shield from some kind of tyranny of the majority if you dispense with the kind of democratic.
Yeah. So right.
Okay.
So I look at the West, and there are countries with constitutions and a few without constitutions. there are presidential democracies and there are parliamentary democracies, and they all suffer from the same problem. What does that show me? That we're dealing with human nature. Our problem, really theoretically, is that we used to be Hamiltonians, right? Alexander Hamilton wrote, I think, Federalist 76, the least dangerous branch of government, right, is the judicial, because they have no influence over the wallet or sword, right? Mm-hmm. They're just powerless. They are passive. They get something to rule over, so you have nothing to fear from the judicial branch. But human nature being what it is, and reality being what it is, what we see in the West today is that every power that is unchecked, and this is what comes out of Hamiltonian theory, right? It's weak. You need to guard the other branches of government that they would not interfere with the judicial, but the judicial is not a threat to anyone, right? Because it's really almost powerless.
Right.
So it's untrue. Over the many years, they've accumulated enough power to be really undemocratic and obtrusive, and they assume powers that are typically governmental or legislative, and they have become, there are two publications now, one 2003 and one a few years ago, one Canadian and one American, called The Most Dangerous Branch.
Right.
They have become very powerful, and because they are unchecked, there are no checking mechanisms really to the court, because we didn't think about it. We thought this was the least dangerous branch. So now we have a constitutional crisis in many Western countries, and definitely where they've decided to do a sort of pooling of judicial powers like the European Union. And their democracies are really powerless. They can't do much. The European courts decide on issues that should be internal and local, mm-hmm. and state, like, they act as a federal court going rogue in Europe. But also in the US, you had periods where you had the federal court going rogue and instructing states to do things that shouldn't be decided federally. We have the same thing in Israel, but it's just one state, a parliamentary democracy, without a constitution, without any defense. But the constitution is not the answer. I always say the judicial activists, they always say there is a formal aspect and a substantive aspect. It's true also about democracy, right? The way you can speak about democracy as something that's to do with elections and people rule and stuff. That's formal democracy. We have a substantive democracy, right? Mm-hmm. So what I'm telling you is, if you would have a constitution legislated today, tomorrow the court will say it's a great constitution, but it's formal. We also have a substantive constitution, and that will override the formal, because the substantial overrides this. I'm not inventing. Actually, Aaron Barak said, really practically said it already. So you have to think about the judicial branch as an actual branch of government wielding a lot of power, and you have to rethink the entire checks and balances system in democracies.
And just to be clear, the idea of the substantive constitution is what is currently an undefined set of rights that they believe comprise democratic societies, and formal is just dealing with structural elements of government and who's allowed to do it.
I agree about the formal. I disagree about the substantive.
I'm trying to define what substantive. Yeah.
So this is what they say, but they would say just rule of human rights decided on by the court. But really, they have no clear theory of human rights. I mean, I could deal with that. Law is all about predictability, right? You know what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, and the prices of not obeying.
Yeah.
It's about predictability. I can adjust my behavior according to law. When they say it's a rule of human rights decided by justices, without anything that allows me to understand what do they mean by that, and they can mean anything by that, and they've proved it that they can mean anything by that, it's just a game of guess. And every lawyer will tell you, in today's court, you know how you go in, you never know how you get out. It's a risk because they just do whatever they want. So, again, I'm sorry I sound cynical, but because there is no real theory, I can't know beforehand what do they mean when they say human rights. It's a power grab. It's just a tool, this vagueness, which is contrary to the way, jurists think about law. Usually you have, for example, why does the court have the power to address lacunas, right? They can, sometimes you say that the law is not applicable, so we have to interpret it to make it applicable, because you want to make it clear, not to make it more vague. But their vagueness is their tool. Mm-hmm. And that leads me to the conclusion that really what they're after is power and not human rights. I mean, of course, I can address specific rulings to show you that their perception of human rights
Can you give me one example? Just one concrete.
There is a very famous sentence by the Supreme Court that says the security of, meaning the human right to live, is supersedes, is more important than the right of Palestinian farmers to grow their crops. Now, I would say, most people would say, living is a higher right than agriculture rights. But in Aaron Barak, in that sentence, he says, you have to be willing to pay a price to maintain human rights. And the price is risking the lives of Israel. This is the wall that Israel built.
Okay.
So the question was, the IDF wanted to build the wall, let's say something like a few hundred meters away from the houses that were in proximity to the wall, to prevent the Palestinians from just using, regular weapons that go a few hundred meters and risking their lives. So say we have to move it, like, let's say 500 yards. Mm-hmm. And Aaron Barak said, no, you can't hurt the agricultural rights of the Palestinians on the other side. So you have, and if an Israeli will be killed, it's a price we have to pay to maintain human rights. Now, most people say the right to security, to live in security, is
also a human right.
It's actually the most basic
ultimate
one.
Human right.
so things like that, it tells you that it's really an ideology masquerading as a human rights theory. But there is no theory. It's all a hoax. It's a big hoax. I mean, I like theories. I would love to read Aaron Barak's theory of human rights. I would like to read any justice's theory of human rights and predict his ruling on different. There is none. Vagueness is the name of the game, because vagueness serves their ruling power. They can just decide whatever they want, ad hoc.
Okay, so,
and not based on principle, which is, again, I would be far more, willing to accept their coup if it gave me some predictability and I knew what I'm up against. But right now, for example, all the cases that go to court, who is the government allowed to fire, who is not, nobody knows. The court can decide whatever they want, and they never reject them, out front.
Right.
They never said this is not justiciable. They never say, no, we have to think about it.
Right. They may say it's not right, but they may not. But they won't say that the issue itself is not justiciable. Okay, so former Chief Justice Aaron Barak has come up a few times here. He recently made the news in Israel for an interview in which and he's not the only one. This refrain has been recurring for many years at this point. He talked about the possibility of civil war in Israel. What do you think? Are we headed there? Are we not headed there? If we're headed there, can we stop it?
So, first of all, Aaron Barak. When Aaron Barak was Chief Justice, I spoke about the least and most dangerous branch. So in 1962, there was another Alexander, not Hamilton, Bickel, a law professor that published a book, The Least Dangerous Branch.
Yeah.
And it was in response to the Warren Court, right, which was very activist. So he tried to defend the court by saying the least dangerous branch, although if you look at Bickel, it was far more democratic than Aaron Barak. I mean, but Aaron Barak would definitely read Bickel. What he took from him is a kind of caution. So Aaron Barak, as Chief Justice, was very cautious, and he did things slowly and not revolutionary, without big declarations. He just, ruling after ruling, he gave the court power after power, but small-scale powers that accumulated to what in 1995 was declared as a revolution.
Right. I mean, Justice Barak was on the bench for 28 years, so he had a long time.
Exactly. So it was smart. It was Bickelian in that sense.
Okay.
Don't, be careful. Don't disturb the political system of agreements and compromises too much. You have to be to tread lightly and carefully when you rule. Once he left office, immediately he turned like the real Barak came out, not the politician, but the ideologue. And for example, when he was Chief Justice, he said, we said it, if the parliament, if the coalition is unhappy with a certain ruling, they can always legislate. They have like the right to respond. A few weeks after he left office, he said it's illegitimate. If the court rules, that's the final word. Like this is what you now as Chief Justice, he knew that they can legislate, but he can overrule it. But he still gave him the legitimacy. Once he left office, he said there's no other legitimate power in government. The only legitimate power of government is the court. This and this is radicalized over time, definitely during the judicial reform, and now speaking about civil war. And really, I mean, during the judicial reform, that's one thing, but now during an actual war, to raise the prospects of civil war, this is going completely haywire. I mean, but what I'm saying, it does show you that he had a plan. It was not, Aaron Barak knew from his moral perspective, this is why he thinks, first of all, Israel is becoming more conservative, more right-wing, which is something that he dislikes.
Sure.
Becoming more national. We have a good sense of a national community. It's growing actually stronger. So those things sociologically and politically disturb him. So what's good about the situation, everything is on the table. I mean, no one in his right mind would say, if there will be a civil war, it would be because the right started it. When they're saying, and if you listen carefully to Aaron Barak, this is what he's saying, and of course all his friends, etc. There will be a civil war because of what the right does politically. They will start the civil war, but they blame the right for legislating or, firing the legal advisor. This will start a civil war, but the right will not start the civil war. The civil war will begin by the left. So it's a threat. This is, and if you listen really carefully, I mean, we can analyze it and I'll show it to you. The threat is if the right-wing government does something that we view as illegitimate, then we might go to the extremes of civil war. Complete lunacy. And also, just for the fun of it, if there will be a civil war, there will not be a civil war. But let's say, hypothetically...
I didn't think so either, yeah.
Hypothetically, there would be the left would lose on the first day. It's just completely nonsense. Complete nonsense. They are, on the streets, they are not powerful. They're only powerful in those bureaucratic echelons of, that bureaucratic class and the academy and the media. But on the streets, it's a joke.
Well, let's hope not to.
Because but it's a good thing. Why it's a joke? Because most of even those who went to Kaplan to protest during the height of the protests in the judicial reform, they will not fight the civil war. They're identified with the protest against the judicial reform, but they don't think the right is the enemy, and they will not become violent. This is just a very small group of.
I mean,
really narcissistic, crazy people.
I was going to agree with you right before you said that. No, I was interviewed actually on JNS. This was the only interview I gave during the reform. And they asked a similar question just to kind of provoke and see where things were headed. And it might be naive at this point after all the things that happened, but it's still very difficult for me to think that the vast majority of the Israeli people would ever engage in that. Left, right, center, whatever. But it actually reminds me of something I encountered when I interviewed students for many years. So I worked at the Tikva Fund, and I'd say probably if I looked back at all the years that I talked to people ranging from first degree through young professional, I mean, it's in the high hundreds, if not over 1,000 at this point. Many, many different candidates for different kinds of seminars. And there was this question about kind of how candidates for seminars saw the challenges facing Israel. And almost always, if there was somebody who wrote to me that they thought it was the social polarization rather than something that was related to security or economics or things like that, then the rest of their ideas were also more reflective of more left-wing values, which I didn't know how to put into perspective for a long time. And then it now makes a little more sense that's just, it's part and parcel of the way in which they're seeing Israeli society, but part of a larger perspective.
It all dovetails, right? It's part of the theory that promotes the supremacy of the court relates to that politics is divisive. And you can see the divisiveness by the growing schisms in Israeli society and the hostility in Israeli society. Now, there is hostility, there are schisms, but it's not as dramatic as usually most of them can be solved politically if we have better political actors, which I hope we will after the next elections and after the war. I hope we'll go to a younger generation that's less... For the current generation, I mean, this is a generation that lost its way, both on the right and the left, because we had so many years of prosperity without any real danger, and the economy was booming, and security issues seemed to be really, on the lower scale of history. So we have...
Did they lose their way together, or did they lose their way in different ways? What does that mean? In one respect, they all lost the way similarly, which is what I say, they view politics as a game, because they think nothing is really on the line. There are no real dangers. Economy booming, security booming. It's all a question of what can we take, what can we achieve within this flourishing great country that Israel was. It still is, but we now have real challenges ahead. And so they played this political game, and in that political game, divisiveness was a tool. Because everybody had to grab something, because it was plentiful, right? There were more than anyone needed, so it was a game of taking as much as you can. And divisiveness plays, it's a great tool when that's the game. But I think the next generation there will be more solidarity in the sense that we understand that we have dangers that we have to face together, both in security and economics, because we are heading to an economic, I don't know if a crisis, but definitely a very serious challenge in economics, in the Israeli economy. And I hope there will be a generation that will be able to find the solidarity that you can find on the streets. I mean, the schism theory is just, again, it's true, but it's true for rather small factions of Israeli society. Most of Israeli society can find mutual grounds. Even the Haredi are more Zionist today than ever, and there is a Zionist left. We have mutual grounds that we can build on, and we can argue over, right? But if you don't forget those mutual grounds, then argument is great. It makes us progress, not deteriorate. If you come from a schism theory, where gaps are unbridgeable, and the only thing you can have is a court ruling in order to put politics aside because politics is dangerous, then you come to the conclusion that this is the most dangerous threat. But it's all ungrounded in reality. So the short-term solution...
So I'm just playing the left.
No, it's I think it's very interesting. It's also encouraging in certain respects. But right now, we're looking ahead, let's say, to potential university striking and a labor union striking and all sorts of chaos again around the Shin Bet, the Attorney General. I don't think there'll be that much pushback to the judicial nominations revision, but that's something we'll go into in a separate episode. So the idea is to ride this out, and then a new generation in your thinking arises in another year or two.
Yeah, I hope so. It's I don't think they will be able to revive Kaplan during the judicial reform because of the war, because people are tired of it. I mean, during the judicial reform, they burned the streets when Netanyahu wanted to fire Yoav Gallant, was the defense minister, right?
Right.
I don't think they'll be able to recreate it, even when it comes to the Gali Barav Miar, the legal advisor of the government. Because people are tired of that. It's people, it used to seem like the most important thing in life. Nobody thinks that way any longer. The elections are not so far away. I mean, what do you have to just wait a year or two, a year and a half, and elect a new government? Right? It's a completely different circumstances, and the gravity of the security situation, and I think also the economics that will kick in soon, will make people reorient their political priorities.
What do you think
the
next government looks like?
Well, I hope the previous generation, most of it, finds itself irrelevant, and we have a much younger echelon of politicians who are not professional politicians. I mean, in today's Israel, you have two kinds of politicians. This is the most common type. Either a political operator, right? Like someone whose business was going into politics from a very young age, and he was doing politics his entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is people from the bureaucracy, right? Like who got to the top of the bureaucracy, and then they are nominated in mostly undemocratic parties, like Lapid's or Gantz, where they take all
parties without primaries,
all the previous heads of something. So I think the system failed. Basically, I think the governments that were formed with those kinds of they failed. We didn't notice that much because things are good.
Yeah.
But now we notice. I think most Israelis would agree that the leadership doesn't rise up to the standard that we expected. People might say, people who love Netanyahu will say that, of course, he's a league of his own, as he used to say. But and of course, there's truth to that, because he's the older generation of Israelis, right? The one that had to fight in Yom Kippur, the one who felt existential threats. So he thinks a little bit more realistically about international affairs, economics, and security. But of course, he also, the October 7th is also on Netanyahu. It's mostly on Netanyahu in a sense, right? Not because of this specific government, but because of the many years that he headed.
Right, the bureaucracy that he effectively let grow around him or appointed in certain respects.
So what I'm saying, the two types failed. The bureaucracy, the heads of bureaucratic institutions turn out to be very faulty politicians, which is not surprising, because real life is not bureaucratic life. And the politician kind of expert type, the one that, knows how to get you to like him, but doesn't know what he wants to do once he gets office, that also is irrelevant. So I'm hoping we will get a younger generation of politicians who come from mid-level, let's say military careers or security careers, mid-level, not top-level, and business-level types, people who founded companies. They don't have to be Elon Musk. There's only one. But people who understands economics through a business perspective and not through an academic perspective, which is very different. And those types, right? People who mid-level, 40-something, who have a record that shows thinking and practical abilities, go into government and fix. We have a failing system. In a sense, what happens now in the US makes my life very easy, because people see, for example, the things that Doge finds. Let me tell you something. If Elon Musk thinks there's 15% of waste, fraud, and abuse in the American government, in Israel we have double that. Because the American supervision of the bureaucracy was always tighter and better than the Israeli one. Okay, so those things grow organically. So once we have people who are really want to get things done, manage, they know where they want to head, and they're not just political apparatchiks or ex-bureaucratic types, I think Israel can regain its footing on security and economics. And listen, I argue a lot against many things that happen today, but I have to say, Israel is the best, from my perspective, the future of the Jewish people, but that's not enough. It's the best place for Jews in the world for many, many years. Going back in history, Jews never lived so happily. And although it doesn't seem that way from the news and from the way that I've described, with so much solidarity and so much appreciation for it. We are one big community, and you saw that on October 7th, and you see it until today. And if you put away the politicians and their propaganda and the bureaucratic battle over its own power, you find a very different Israel. When you go to the ground, when you speak to people, when you ask, what do you think? You don't go to the protests, you just go to the people who observe the protests, and they will tell you. Even if I agree with the messaging, I don't agree with the action.
I wish I could end there. I have one final question, because that was perfect. That was we could have done like a good finale at the end. Okay, so you mentioned earlier that the idea of a constitution doesn't really solve very much, certainly in the present time. Is there something that needs to happen in the long term in order to secure the Israeli interest, the Israeli society?
Yeah. So we are back to a kind of political institutional question.
Or not, you can say.
After I gave such a good speech about
it was inspiring.
Yeah, no. But,
and yet.
So what's the problem? Why doesn't the Constitution solve? Because the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, including in regard to its own powers.
But okay, so if that's not it, is there something else that needs to happen, or is it just there's going to be an organic evolution of something?
There are solutions.
Yeah.
For example, in Israel, I'm all for the. Let me put it this way. The problem in Israel with the judicial branch in Israel is that the Supreme Court is the first and last arka'a. The first and last court. It's the only court when you go to constitutional.
It's the court of first and last resort, but that's not what arka'a means. Arka'a is a formal term that I'm having a hard time translating. Anyway, okay. First and last resort.
So if you have a hard time translating, I'm not feeling guilty that I can find.
I feel terrible right now.
So. If you have a constitutional question, you go to the Supreme Court and it decides, and you cannot in any way appeal to anyone over that decision. So I'm thinking that just institutionally, of course, legally, this is terrible. The fact that you can't appeal a legal decision is outrageous, and it shouldn't happen, and it doesn't happen in any other kind of court and decisions.
Right.
So this is an offense to legal theory, really, that you can't appeal. Like 3 judges will sit and they will decide. No one in the world can ever question the validity of their decision. And no one did before and no one will do after. So I'm thinking we need some sort of constitutional court, although we don't have a constitutional, for constitutional questions, specifically with regards to legitimacy of decisions and separation of powers. And the model I like the most is the French Constitutional Court, but it doesn't have to be the French. That's not important. What's important is that someone within the judicial branch has to supervise the Supreme Court, which is only called Supreme because it's the only one, right? No one said that when it comes to a constitution that Israel doesn't have, this is the supreme something. But, so I think this will calm things down and reduce the level of crazy activism. But when I say activism, I'm relating specifically to self-assuming powers.
Right.
This is the level of activism that we have in Israel. It's not just a decision that oversteps some boundary. These are decisions regarding the court's own powers. So there they have to have a check before it goes to the other branches within the judicial branch. It can't be the first and last court that decides on its own powers. But this is what I started with that point. All things are eventually human. And no system lasts forever. I mean, the American system, which is the most impressive democratic system that I think grew out of very interesting debates and questions that formed the constitution that replaced the non-federal Articles of Confederation, right, that you had and didn't work. And so it's an impressive political fit, and it worked very well for a long time. But that also, people are people. And any loophole that you can see when you design something, there will be someone who realizes that he can grab some power. So the whole game of power grabbing means that you don't have an internal political system that guarantees separation of powers and legitimacy being spread properly according to the functions of government and all. You always have to be wary. You always have to be willing to adjust and reform when something that used to work stops working, because we're humans, and it means that sometimes we make good things bad. We have also the opposite is true, but that we also have to take that into consideration.
Okay, so now we're going to rely on that nationalist sentiment that both you and I hold dear. And I want to thank you very, very much for coming. You've opened up 18 new episodes that I hope to invite you back for. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
That concludes this week's episode. Join us next week for a closer look at the changes made to the Judicial Selections Committee and its projected impact on Israel's ever-evolving democracy. See you soon.